A recent NPR article caught my attention, saying that since its legalization and commercialization, cannabis use among teens and young adults has skyrocketed. And not only cannabis, but hallucinogens as well. It's reported that in 2021, an estimated 43% of young people experimented with cannabis, and 29% had used marijuana in the past month of when they did this report. And a whopping 11% of young people said they used marijuana daily. 11%. So daily use, as defined in this article, is 20 or more times in a month, and it was up like 4 or 5% from 2016 when they last measured it. The number of young people who said they used marijuana vape in the past month doubled from 2017 to 12% in 2021, which has its own difficulties or its own challenges because vape delivers a stronger hit. It includes a lot of detrimental chemicals to the lungs, etc. So these are the highest levels ever recorded. And of course, young people aren't just doing marijuana, but they're mixing marijuana with other things like alcohol and hallucinogens. And keep in mind, this is not the weed that some of us may have tried in the 60s and 70s. I don't think they measured the THC levels in the 60s and 70s. They were too busy smoking. But, oh, Venable has more information about this. What was the THC level in?
I don't remember.
Okay.
But I worked on 2 marijuana research projects in college.
Okay, so Venable worked on 2 marijuana research projects in college, but she can't remember the content or the THC level. But in 1995, the average THC concentration of cannabis in the US was 3.5%. By 2005, that had gone up to 7%. And in 2018, the average was 14%, and in some cases even higher. In Washington State, they have some of the highest percentage THC levels. CBD is another compound in cannabis, and it's getting a lot of good airtime lately because they're finding that there are some benefits to using CBD, like helping with pain relief, reduction in symptoms of anxiety and PTSD, depression, insomnia, and nausea, just to name a few. And the CBD to THC ratio, which affects the way the THC interacts with our body, has also changed over that time. You can now buy cannabis with specific CBD to THC ratios. In fact, on the internet, you can find all sorts of menus that you can choose from. So marijuana is now legal in 19 states. Washington was the first to legalize it. I'd forgotten that, 2012. 41 states now allow medical marijuana programs, and 23 of those states have decriminalized its use. And marijuana is fully illegal in 4 states. Idaho is one of them. So marijuana has the reputation of being benign, non-habit forming, a harmless pleasure. But we need to examine that. It's true in the sense that you can't OD on marijuana. That's true. But using cannabis contributes to many other diseases. Every year it results in an estimated 2 million years of healthy life lost due to disability. Long-term use leads to addiction in about 10% of the users, and about 50% of daily users experience withdrawal symptoms when they go without it. So it's having an impact. Cannabis use contributes to cognitive impairment. Duh, isn't that the reason people smoke? So learning, memory, and attention are all impaired because cannabis has been shown to damage the hippocampus, which is particularly associated with memory. Long-term users tend to score between 6 to 8 points lower on IQ tests. So this is especially alarming for adolescents and young people under the age of 24 whose brains are literally still forming and can be damaged by especially chronic use of marijuana. So our friend Patricia, who is part of the Cougar Health Services at Washington State University, came and gave us a talk on this subject a few years ago. And she said she often asks students referred to her for counseling questions like, what motivates you to smoke marijuana? And that's a really great question. What is motivating me to take up marijuana? She has them write out a list of pros and cons for using pot, and pros usually include things like, well, it's pleasurable. It's kind of nice to be high. It helps me cope with anxiety and the overwhelms of life. It helps me to sleep, allows me to check out for some time, and makes me feel like everything's going to be okay. So there may be some of these short-term benefits. But when she asks them to identify the cons, they say things like, well, it makes me really dull and stupid. It impacts my memory and my ability to study. It doesn't actually change any of the underlying problems and causes of anxiety and overwhelm. And the difficulties are still there, whether it's personal, interpersonal, like low self-esteem or lack of self-confidence, or the more existential things like climate change and pandemic and things like that. Some people say that marijuana helps them to fall asleep, but if they really check up their patterns, what they find is it disrupts their sleep once they fall asleep. So they end up being chronically tired as a result of smoking. And everything in life is not okay when the high is over, so actually some of them are recognizing that they would be better off to find coping mechanisms that work in the long term as well as in the short term. So Patricia asks them, what kind of experience do you really want to have? If you're looking for pleasure, you're looking for a high, you're looking for anxiety relief, what kind of experience do you really want to have? And then she says, look at these pros and cons and weigh it out for yourself. Yes, there are some short-term pleasures or short-term relief, but at what cost? That's really the question. What are the long-term difficulties that come along from using an external agent as your coping mechanism? For example, eating a dozen donuts may temporarily relieve our hunger, but if you had a steady diet of white donuts or glazed donuts or chocolate donuts, in the long term, that's going to be detrimental. So often studies on marijuana use self-reported and subjective information. So it's difficult to really know more than just a snapshot of what's really happening with people, and how marijuana impacts people. But there was one important study of 1,000 kids that followed them from birth through the age of 38, and I hope it continues, but at least through the age of 38. So it was like the ideal study to get a picture of health before the onset of cannabis use, and then following up with those who chose to start using cannabis. Those who started smoking cannabis earlier, like around the age 13, especially chronic smokers, had significantly higher detrimental effects on their brain, as you might expect. They showed decline in memory, verbal comprehension, reasoning, executive functions, and processing speed. And also, they had significant long-term impairment on their social and emotional development that can persist throughout their lifetime. In fact, when I was talking with Patricia about this one time, she said that often people get stunted at a particular level of their life when they started chronically using pot. And so a person may be in their 20s, late 20s, 30s, 40s, but they're still reacting to things like a 13-year-old or a 15-year-old because of that impairment. So when people are making decisions about using cannabis, then delaying the age of starting allows that fragile adolescent brain to continue developing fully. That may be a hard sell with a 13-year-old, but whatever we can do as caring adults, as supportive adults in the life of a young person, then we should find skillful means to do that. The good news for adults is that 3 months after stopping using cannabis, the plasticity of the mind allows for repair of most of cognitive functions that were damaged. But again, it depends when a person started using pot and how much they used. So I haven't had any intoxicants since 1995 when I took refuge with Venerable. And as a practitioner, I see how hard it is to maintain a mind that's clear and calm and focused and, getting some memory going in my studies. So, and that's without intoxicants. If we're really interested in the Dharma, why make it harder for ourselves? Really, people who still think they can have a toke here and there and get away with it. Well, maybe. But keep in mind that cannabis impairs motor skills, like driving. Who are the people who have the most accidents? Young males. Who are the people who tend to smoke pot? Young males. Guess what? Put those two things together. There's an increased risk of accidents and injuries, increased respiratory problems like bronchitis and asthma, increased pulse and blood pressure, which contributes to stiffening of arteries. That's one of the detriments. And this also contributes to acute myocardial events like strokes. In fact, did you know that for the first hour after a person smokes marijuana, they have a 5-fold increase in the chance of having a heart attack? Benign, harmless. It also can contribute to cancer. I mean, think about it, taking a hot chemical into your lungs, any hot chemical, especially vaping with the additional chemicals that go with vaping. It contributes to periodontal disease, and it also contributes to poor psychosocial and mental health outcomes. So there are a lot of detriments. Yes, there may be a few short-term benefits, and like I said, CBD separated from the THC, maybe there's some you can make a case for that. But in general, THC is, in the long term, not going to be so good for us. So is smoking weed or vaping weed or ingesting edibles really the benign, harmless pleasure that it purports to be? You know, our mind is the greatest asset that we have. It's the greatest asset. So we need to do everything we can to take care of our mind and to use it to develop our full potential so that we can benefit countless beings.